not to switch horses in the middle of the stream. Today we're going to find out if that is accurate. We had our men's study yesterday. I want to thank the men who were able to make it out, and I understand that scheduling and timing and everything else is always never perfect whenever you pick out a date. It's not going to work for everyone. We did try to put we try to record all the videos for those who would like to hear the lessons. They are there. There are 3 of them that are really good. You can skip the first one and just go right on to the next 3. We are really hoping that we are able to continue this for future years. We're going to continue with the teens in the spring and the men in the winter, fall, whatever season this is. Fall, they claim it's fall. I still haven't felt too much cold weather yet. I'm waiting for the day to put on a jacket. That hasn't happened yet. So that's the day I'll call fall. Anyways, Job chapter 1. The book of Job is a notoriously difficult book. I'm not going to give you all of the answers today. In fact, I'm going to present some questions and very few answers. We often look at our lives, especially during the hard times, and we ask why. Sometimes, like David, we ask how long, and the answer isn't always given to the individuals who are going through it. David isn't answered in the book of Psalms of, okay, you have 4 more days, 16 hours, and 32 more minutes until this is all over. He asks how long, and that's it. And the answer for Job is very similar. Here in Job chapter 1 and chapter 2, everything's taken by God. And that's how Job sees it. That's how Job's friends see it. And by the end of the book, God seems to take credit for it. It is God who presents this before Satan. He asks Satan, have you considered my servant Job, in verse 8? And then Satan has to come to God for permission for each of the things that happens after that. And Job is left to wonder why. And Job's friends question why. For the entire book, they go back and forth over why God has done this. And Job is not given an answer. In fact, when he demands his day in court, he demands to stand before God, he demands an answer, God gives him a lot more questions without answers. And I'm not going to try to oversimplify things, but I'm going to try to oversimplify things this morning. I want us to consider that sometimes God takes in order to give something better back. That isn't an answer that is explicitly given here in the book of Job, but we see here Job's, all of his finances and his family is laid out, verses 1 through 5. 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camel, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and many servants. He was vastly wealthy at this time. And if you turn to the very last page of Job, way to the end of Job 42, there in verse 10, that the Lord restored the fortunes of Job, and when he prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. And so here in verse 12, so the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than the beginning. I want us to just take a few moments, and we're going to look at a variety of different times in which God does this. And it's not to say that this happens every time, but there are some really good examples in the Bible of when God takes with one hand in order to give with another hand. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 50. And all of these stories, I think, are ones that we're going to know fairly well, so we're not going to take the time and to walk through each of the steps individually, but I want us to take some time and to consider what happens to these individuals from their perspective. Joseph is born, almost the youngest of all of his siblings. Well loved by his parents. He lives in the lap of luxury. We talk about Joseph in his technicolor coat or his multicolor coat. Maybe a different translation would be a coat with long sleeves. Odd way to look at it, but it would be a house coat, not in our sense of a house coat, but it would signify a coat that was worn for an individual who lived a luxurious life. You would have to roll up your sleeves to get to work, as we talk about today, and so they would just have short sleeves, and that would be their work coat. Joseph was given a coat that would signify that he lived luxuriously. compared to all of his siblings. Things were going really well for him. His brothers beat him up, plan on killing him, saved by one of his brothers, and then he's sold into slavery. You go from being the person who is over the slaves and over your brothers to being someone who is now under everybody else. And then finally things seem to start to go well. He is placed in Potiphar's house, and he does well. Everything that he touches has the Midas effect, and they just turn to gold, and things are going extremely well. And he even does right by his master, even when his master's wife has no intention of doing right by her husband. And you think, surely this is the time that God's going to bless, and he's thrown into prison. And even there he works hard, and he's exalted. And all of this comes about to the point where there's a famine in the land. And his family needs somewhere to go. And Joseph's at the right place at the right time in order to be the blessing that his family needs. And here in chapter 50, there in verse 15, it takes his brothers a long time to get to where they are at this point. They weep and they cry over one another earlier, years before. But notice the timing of this in verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." And so they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgressions of your brothers and their sins, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servant of God for your father." I want us to consider Joseph's standpoint, where he is at this point. What reason in your own mind could you give for what God has allowed you to go through? He wasn't a bad son. He wasn't a bad brother. He was a young man, and as we would even say, he might be even young enough for us to really kind of let him off the hook for any of the mischievous things that he might have done. Joseph stands kind of almost unique. While we know he was certainly not sinless, we see no mistakes in his life, as the Bible records for us. What reason could you have for him suffering all the things he did at his family's hand? Or what reason could you think of that would allow him to suffer at the hands of Potiphar? Can you think of anything that Joseph could think back on and say, well, this is the reason that God has done all this to me? But notice his mindset here in verse 18. Or verse 17, Joseph wept when he spoke to him. And his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said, "Do not fear, for I am in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and for your little ones." And thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph has the perspective that I think we're shooting for today. God never comes to Joseph and says, "This is why I did this." There's no point in time where he says, "Okay, just a little while longer and you'll understand." As far as we know, Joseph is just by himself. And he has to reason through this and rely on faith to get to the point where he understands that God meant this for good. That in him taking away all of his comfort and his family, taking away his security, his safety, his freedom, his land, the people that spoke his own language, that God intended to give something back that was going to benefit him and his family for generations to come. That's a hard perspective to have. Turn with me over to Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3. Let's consider Paul for a few moments. We don't know a ton about Paul's personal life before becoming a Christian. We can deduce a few things. He has Roman citizenship. That's a big plus. That he was taught at the feet of Gamaliel, which means his family was probably decently well off. We know here, as we get into chapter 3, where Paul describes how, his life and the things that he used to have reason to boast in. In verse 5, he said he was circumcised at the 8th day. He was a person of the tribe of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and a Hebrew of Hebrews. And as to the law, a Pharisee, and as to zeal, a persecutor of the church. We know that he's on the Sanhedrin council and cast his votes. Paul is a rising star in his community. He makes the point in another passage that he is exceeding beyond his own people of his own age. He is doing really well. He needs to change, though. I mean, obviously we know that. We know that he's a persecutor of the church. We know that he needs to become a Christian. Why is it that he cannot just simply become a Christian? Why is it that God takes everything away from him? He loses his job. He loses his position in the community. He's going to then, in a couple years, flee for his life out of a window through a basket. He's going to be beaten and stoned and shipwrecked. He's going to be hungry, and he's going to spend night and a day adrift at sea. Why is it that God allows everything to be taken away from him? Paul has a perspective here in Philippians chapter 3. There in verse 7, but whatever gain I had, all of those blessings, all of those earthly things, all of the prestige and power, all the things that might have been, all of those things, I count as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus Christ my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things and count them all as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and to be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share in his sufferings, and become like him in his death, and that by any means possible I may obtain the resurrection from the dead. Why was God willing to take all that from Paul? Because he gave him something so much more. And Paul understood that. It may have taken him a little while. I'm not entirely sure how long it took him to see just this perspective. But all that, all the things that we would count as being great, having a position of power or authority, of respect and honor, of having money or wealth, having a career, one that we've studied all of our lives for, being a part of our own people, having our place in the community, whatever it is that you would find a sense of being or purpose. Paul says he counts all of that as rubbish for the sake of simply knowing Jesus Christ and be found in his resurrection. What God took with one hand, he gave so much more with the other hand. Go with me over to Matthew chapter 10, or Mark chapter 1, sorry. Mark chapter 1. Jesus is up front with this one. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way by any means, just he explains it right offhand. He's passing here in verse 16 along the seaside of Galilee, and he sees two men, Simon and Andrew. He's been previously introduced to them, they've been introduced to him, and he calls them now to come and follow him and to work for him. But they're busy. I mean, they're casting their nets into the sea. They had a job. They were fishermen. They had families to support. They had all kinds of things that you would imagine that would keep them tied, pun intended, to their nets. But here in verse 17, Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." It's one of those little kid stories we tell a lot. I don't mean it's a little kid story, but it happened. That's what we teach in Bible class. We have the little fishing rods and little fish, and we teach them about Simon and Andrew. And sometimes we forget that Jesus took away their livelihood at this time. The comfort and the security of their daily jobs, gone. And they shared a collective money bag from this point on. They would travel with him, sleep whatever they could sleep, they could eat whatever food was provided to them. They would go in inner towns, and if there wasn't a place for them to stay, they would have to move to the next town. And it wasn't just hopping in the car and driving down I-64 and getting there in the next 15 minutes to find a new town. They had to walk there, which means they may be sleeping out for the night. If they weren't provided food, they may not have food that night. They have to wait till the next day. Jesus took a lot from them that day when he said, come and follow me. But what he gave with the other hand is a lot. I'm going to make you fishers of men. He gave them companionship from God himself. And so much more. But there was a price to pay up front. That God took that from them on one hand and gave with the other hand a lot. If you go over to Matthew chapter 16, Jesus is going to require that same thing. We had looked at this passage, I think, last week. There in verse 24. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what would it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what would a man give in return for his soul? He asked the question, what if God took everything away and gave you eternal salvation? Would it be worth it? If he took with one hand to give something much, much more with the other hand, could you see the value in that? If you're going to hold on to your life and not be willing for God to take away all it is that you find precious or dear, or the things that give you purpose or meaning in life, would it be worth it? He makes the point that if you save your life, meaning that you hoard it to yourself, that you hold it and you're not willing to give that up, that all the things that make you you, then you really lose it. But if you're willing to allow God to take that, and he gives it back in abundance. Paul mentions this over in 1 Timothy chapter 6, that we can have life and have it more abundantly. It seems counterproductive for us to give God our lives for him to give us abundant life. But that's what he asked for. The same thing we see in Mark chapter 1 with Simon and Andrew, where they have to give up their livelihood in order to get so much more. Sometimes that's exactly what's required of us. Over in Matthew chapter 10, a couple of chapters back, we see here in chapter 10 that he tells them that there may be some big sacrifices, even some very personal ones to their family. He makes a point in verse 34 of Matthew chapter 10. Do not think that I have come to bring peace on earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. And whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. That's a big one. To have God take family from you as a cost of discipleship, that you have to have internal strife with your family. Maybe to break those relationships up. Remember what his disciples said. They came and they proclaimed, we've left all of this for you. The last house and mother and father for you. He makes the point that whoever leaves mother or father or brother or sister for me shall receive 100-fold back. I have a big family. Grandparents were productive. Great-grandparents were productive. I have a large family. If you go to West Virginia, it seems I'm related to most of them. And then my other family, my mom's side, spread all over the globe. But I have a much, much, much bigger family in the church. And for those who have gotten to travel and gotten to meet with Christians other places, that you immediately walk into a congregation and you meet brand new family that you never knew. And that's wonderful. As big as my physical family is, the church family is so much bigger. And sometimes God requires you to give up your family in order to give you a better family. What he takes with one hand, he may give abundantly back with the other hand. And there's a lot of areas in life we can talk about. We won't spend a ton of time. Sometimes we ask the question of why would God take my health? Maybe the answer is to give you deeper faith. We see that all the time in individuals in the scriptures who have an outlet of blood or an ill servant or a dying child. And we see their faith grow abundantly during those times of trials. That testing that produces something in them that doesn't produce in other people. We mentioned back in Matthew chapter 5 when we were going through the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Why has God taken away my comfort? In any variety of aspects. Maybe it is to comfort you in areas that you were suffering that you didn't realize. Or to give you true comfort. John chapter 16, we'll turn there for a moment. John chapter 16, we'll look at the very last verse in John chapter 16. We talked about this the past couple weeks when we looked at the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who persecute you, or when they persecute you. And blessed are you whenever others revile you and speak all kinds of evil against you. Why is it that God would take my peace? Why is it that God would allow me to suffer in this life for proclaiming him openly? Why is it that if the laws continue to change in this country, that things are going to get a lot worse for us? Why would he allow that? In verse 33, Jesus gives this answer to his disciples who have to suffer a lot. I have said these things to you that in me you have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. Take heart, I have overcome the world. Whatever lack of peace I have, I'm only going to have it for a short time. You know, that clock that seemed to never ever come when I was in my 20s and my teens, that clock is seeming a whole lot more real lately. And I'm sure every year from here on out, whatever years I have left, that clock is going to be ever more present. My time is limited. And whatever suffering I suffer here, it's only going to be for a time, for a season. My life is but a vapor that passes. And what I really need is peace with God. And if it requires him to take my peace here on this earth in order that I can have eternal peace with him, seems worth it. Seems like a really good trade-off. He makes the point earlier back in chapter 15 that if I was in the world, if I was of the world, and the world would love me, I would have all that peace that the world could provide. But then the Father wouldn't know me. And Jesus would deny me before him. And then I would have no peace for all of eternity. And so what God takes with one hand, he gives abundantly with the other hand. Sometimes you wonder, why does God take away my blessings? Whatever blessing it is that you may be suffering the lack of right now. And it very well may be that he could give you a different blessing. Why is it that God is allowing me to have that lack of an ease of life? There are a lot of people who teach that God wants you to have your best life now. That he wants you to have all the blessings now. But why is it that God would allow us as righteous people who are diligently trying to serve him, why would he allow us to live a hard life like Paul or Joseph or Jesus? James chapter 1, we had mentioned this one I think recently, and 1 Peter as well. That we know that the testing produces something. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 1. There in verse 6. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6. He says, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. Why is it that God would allow us to even temporarily be grieved? If God loves us, if he is able to keep us from suffering now, then why would he allow this to happen? Well, Peter gives us a really good reason. So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to the result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's going to produce something. It's going to be refining us. It's going to have a benefit. And when With what God is able to take away with one hand, he can produce something much better with the other for us. And sometimes what we do is we complain and we whine and we worry so much about what God has just allowed to be taken away, or he himself has taken away. But I want that. And sometimes we see that with our children, as you raise children. They want that one thing that they just had, and they just don't want to give it up, and they're going to whine and complain, they're going to cry about that one thing that they just lost. When you know that right around the corner you have something just planned out for them that's way, way better. And we get to see that we know what's on both sides. We know what we're taking away, and we know what we're hoping to give them. And so oftentimes we're the little kid who just, I want that right now. I want this thing that I currently have. I don't want to give this one up. And we have all these examples in the Bible of God saying, well, if you just give this one up, there's something better waiting for you. And we say, I don't know. I don't know if I can believe in that. I don't know if I can have hope in that because I like this that I have right here. And yet what we get to see is Joseph has a great perspective. That God meant it for good. Paul has that same perspective. And all that other stuff that we're told to give up, that's but rubbish. It's worthless in comparison to what we get. What Jesus requires of us is that we lose our lives because he has a life waiting for us. So I don't know, we're not given all the reasons for all the things we go through. And my job isn't today to oversimplify everything. But I want us to be willing to consider that what God has taken, he is able to give back more abundantly. Whether it's our health or our peace or our family or our comfort, our current hopes or dreams in order to give us better hopes and dreams, or even our life itself. Whatever God is willing to take, he's willing to give back more abundantly. And the whole point kind of hinges on this. Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. There in verse 28. Hopefully a verse we kind of have begun to memorize already. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. And it may be that God is willing to take away blessings now in order for you to see your need for him. But all things work together for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And if you don't love God, then what God is willing to take away now, he's not going to return with something good. That a punishment is a punishment without a blessing at the other end. But a blessing is promised for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose, who turn to him. And there's always an eternal blessing in that end. And that choice is up to us, whether we receive punishment or we receive something that benefits us on the other side. That's really up to us. And if there's a point, if you're at the point where you do not know if you're saved, or if you don't know if your heart is right with God, then don't wait any longer. Don't hold on to that life of yours. Don't grasp onto and not be willing to give up, because whatever you are going to give up, you're going to lose in the end. But if you're willing to give it up, if you're willing to give it to God fully, then he will give you life and give you life abundantly. There is no blessing that he will withhold from you at that point. Eternal life is yours. There's nothing else we could ask for. And if we can help you to do that this morning, let us know as we stand in sitting number 122.